Hi, my name is Preston, so I'm a PhD student at the University of Alberta, and I'm going to be discussing about some work that I did in conjunction with when I was working with Solstice Canada. So I was my co-author, Ian Bassford at Solstice, who was the other person who contributed to this project. So the goal of our project was to generate a soil map using a combination of field inspection data and remote sensing data. So in terms of the model inputs, what data we used a combination of Landsat data, so imagery, multispectral image satellite data, vegetation heights derived from LiDAR data, and a number of terrain attributes that are derived from LiDAR data that I'll discuss in a little more detail further on. So we had soil soil classifications from 166 inspection locations from an environmental impact assessment. And there was 3 broad classes that we were classifying to: upland mineral, glaisol, and organic soils. So upland mineral is actually a mix of brunosols and luvasolic soils. Glaisols would be a range from peaty regoglacisols to orthic-luvic glaisols, and organics, terric and typic fibersols and mesosols. The reason for using those very broad categories is, with all these kind of exercises, the more precise you get, the more inaccurate you get, and the more difficult it is to model the landscape because you get much more mistyping. So, and it kind of goes with the sort of say general philosophy with maybe science in general, but soil mapping. Precise and accurate map is completely useless, but an imprecise accurate map still has some potential use. And the other reason is that these 3 classes also correspond to P approval conditions about what types of soils need to be managed, and there's different management practices in these broad classes. So the soil data, just to give you an idea of the area, we've got a range of soil points that were distributed across the site. A range of mineral soil sites, organics and glaisols, some sort of pattern fen networks and other organic soils, and upland mineral area. So there's a range on this site. The surface forms are high relief hummocky to low relief, high relief undulating to low relief hummocky. So it is relatively more subdued slopes than what you'd find in some other parts of the province, with extensive sort of flat plain, organic plain peatland areas. So one of our key modeling tools that we used was Landsat data. So if we sort of think about what you use for digital soil mapping or conventional soil mapping, you're looking for data that can be used relating to your soil forming factors or CLORPT. So how does soil vary on the landscape? It varies due to changes in soil forming factors. So what data can we find that's related to or correlated with those soil forming factors to sort of capture that variation across the landscape? So the nice thing about Landsat data, one, it's free. So that's pretty nice, free from the US government. The other is you get a whole range of different light wavelengths that are captured. So you have your standard blue, green, and red to make your regular color image, the kind you'd see from regular aerial photography. But some of the very interesting aspects of what you get is you also get results in the near infrared range, which there is a very strong vegetation response. So as chlorophyll content varies in vegetation, you get strong changes in your near infrared. And then shortwave infrared bands, which is a longer wavelengths, also responds to changes in soil moisture and vegetation. All the way up into the thermal infrared here, which strongly varies with changes in soil moisture. So that ends up giving you a lot more data than what you'll get with your standard air photo imagery. So to give you an idea of what some of those differences look like, I made a few images where I'm combining different band colors to make, this is our natural color of red, green, blue, to show where we can see some of the features on the landscape. And then if we look at our near infrared, so in this case what I did was I swapped out the blue and put in our near infrared band. So we can see that there's patterns in the vegetation that start to show up that are faintly visible here, but start to jump out quite significantly throughout our upland mineral areas and along some of these transition zones, with some of these organic channel networks having some very strong signatures that we start to see. And then if we look at our thermal infrared, you also see some very strong, some visual, very strong differences with some of these transition zones becoming quite more distinct than what you'd see in the red, green, blue bands. But one of the things about the thermal infrared range is that the spatial resolution for those bands is much coarser, so you lose some detail about what you can pick out with them. So certain features are much more visible in that range, but the pixels are about 3 times the size, so you lose all sorts of other landscape variation details are no longer visible. So it ends up as a trade-off between sort of the advantage of what that gives you versus some of the spatial detail that you lose. So for terrain parameters, what we took was we had LiDAR data where we had both the canopy heights derived from that data as well as the digital elevation model that we used to derive a number of parameters. So one of the key things with this kind of mapping is you can't just feed in the straight elevations, because if you've got a site that's just sloping all the way along, it's going to just tell it's different on one side from the other. So what you want to try to identify is how does local variations in topography. And some of the key ones are your slope curvature, so your rate of change of your slope, and then the slope in terms of what's your slope in a local neighborhood. So we looked at what we integrated was maximum curvature. So what that is it looks in every direction around a point, where's your maximum slope curvature. Then minimum curvature, so what's the minimum curvature in any direction. Planned curvature, which is the curvature sort of cross-sectional with the slope, and then the slope itself. There's also profile curvature, but in the modeling process we found that it didn't add any extra value, so it was left out. So how are we going to take all this data? What's the method that we're going to use to try to make image out of it? So I came across in the academic literature a modeling technique called the random forest analysis, which has been used quite extensively in the remote sensing world because it's a very flexible non-parametric technique that can handle a lot of different data sources, and it also has some less issues with some things such as overtraining, where you can build models that fit really, really well for the data you fed in, but they don't work well when you move them to new areas. And the way it works is the modeling process builds hundreds of decision trees and classification trees, and then it runs your data set through each of those classification trees and uses the results in aggregate to come up with a classification. So it's really built on the power of averaging. So if you're classifying, as in my example, and you have just a category, then what it does is it calculates what's your modal response. So what's the most frequent prediction out of all of your decision trees, and that's the prediction that's used. If you use it for regression functions, you're trying to predict specific values, then it'll use the mean. So the idea is that what it does is that it leaves out about 30% of your data for every tree development, so it's a random assortment of data that's actually fed into the process. And if you have some relatively poor trees, then those results get kind of averaged out in the process. And the other advantage is because you're doing all these iterative model runs, it can give you an internal error estimation that's called the out-of-bag error, because it's called bagging data is what the sort of terms they use. You have to talk to statisticians about why they pick those terms. I'm not exactly sure. But it's a really good internal validation tool to give you a general idea of how accurate the model you've developed is. And it also generates something called a confusion matrix, so it can break down that accuracy to tell you, okay, which classes are breaking down for me, which classes are working really well, and which ones are working really poorly. So this is the results that you get to try to tell you, okay, how accurate is our model. So in our example, we've had an overall error rate of 20%. So overall, on average, there was a 20% misclassification. But if we dig down into what was going on, we see that almost all of that error was happening in terms of our glacials, so our transitional zones. And I have a few ideas about why that is. But if we go to our mineral soils, it was only a 15% error, and organic soils had a 10% error rate in the modeling process. So I've been thinking a lot about, okay, what's going on with the glacials, and I have a few ideas. The one is that based on the data we had available to us, we don't have a lot of glacial data. There's only 20 out of 166 points. So we probably don't have enough data to truly capture the variation of those glacialic soils. The other reason is that the Landsat's pixels are about 15 meters by 15 meters. So if you think about what you find in a lot of areas of the Boreal about how large is our transition zones, we could end up with having a lot of our pixels sort of half and half in a glacial and half in another class, so it ends up being very hard to characterize those well. A way to overcome that is there is commercial data you can buy that'll give you 2 meter pixels, but you're looking at a couple $1,000s per township for that. So for our cases, working with some of the free data sets, these are the results we could get, but with some commercial data, you may be able to push your accuracies quite a bit up in some of those highly variable areas. If we look next, we want to look at what kind of results we got. Okay, we threw a ton of different model parameters in there. What does it all mean? What's contributing the most? What's helping us explain variation in our data set the best and make the best predictions? So the other output that you get in a random forest analysis is it gives you this graph with something called a mean decrease in accuracy. So because you're doing these iterative model runs, it can tell you, so if we left out vegetation height, for example, how much decrease in accuracy would you have in your model? So what we found was that having that LiDAR vegetation height data was the most important factor. It was in terms of getting accurate model predictions. And then slope was the next important. And then in terms of our Landsat data, it was really our thermal infrared range, near infrared, and shortwave infrared was all much better at identifying for our soil classes than our standard red, green, blue, which contributed actually relatively little when you want to compare that to what the shortwave infrared and thermal infrared contributed. So that's the other thing I really like about this modeling process is you can get an overall accuracy, but you also can see what variables are most important for the accuracy of this system, and you also can kind of throw everything at the wall and see, okay, this stuff, I have a bunch of variables that are contributing nothing, so I might as well just throw them out because it's just adding data processing cost and time. So the other result that I want to tell you is the other question we have is how many trees do we want to run? So you're basically looking for these graphs to start flatlining, and that'll let you know that you run enough trees. The reason that's important in the modeling process is that if you think about an image, we have 7 million cells in our example. It's going to need, every single cell needs to get classified 500 times if we have 500 trees. So using my ThinkPad laptop, I've got about a 5-minute processing time for this analysis with 500 trees, but it becomes about 2 to 3 hours if you go up to 5,000. So this is where you need to understand, okay, how many do we need to run and keep it at the minimum? So as soon as your levels flatline, you're saying you're getting no extra accuracy for more trees. So what did we actually get? Here's our final map of that area that we generated. So our red is our glacialic soils, and these are our transition areas. The sort of yellowish is upland mineral, and blue is deep organic. So we picked up a lot of these buffer zones, actually picked up much better than I thought based on the internal accuracy estimates. But we also picked up a lot of these peatland networks came out quite distinctly, as well as some internal areas with poor drainage, and then our stream networks and other things came out with upland soils. So if we want to look at, okay, I want to compare what was predicted at a site versus what was actually measured, then the results actually came out better than I expected. So we actually only had one mineral site misclassified, all of the organic soils classified correctly. And the glacials actually did really well, and I was thinking about why that was, considering the internal error was so high, and I think that's because it's not classifying glacials well, but because it's classifying mineral and organic soils well, it's pushing the unknown stuff by default into the glacial category. So, for example, I tried adding brunosols to this, and it could not classify them correctly. All of them were misclassified. So obviously, we're missing some data to be able to break up our mapping to a soil order level. But as a start, I was pleasantly surprised to see how well this actually worked. So where are we going with this next? So we need additional data sources to separate soil types in greater detail, particularly brunosols. We need to find ways to improve our internal model glacial prediction accuracy, because again, as soon as we added an additional category, then that glacial category kind of fell apart. And then we want to test this previously developed models on new areas. So it's one thing to build a model that works really well in the area you trained it on, but it's a whole other test to see how well does it generalize to new areas. And then the other thing is, I think optimally these kind of systems work best by collecting field data and then pairing that field data with these modeling processes. It is very difficult to judge blindly what the soil types are going to be. You know, people with lots of experience can make some hypotheses, but particularly those transition zones can be tricky. So there's also steps of what's the optimal field collection protocol to support these kind of modeling procedures, because you need to go about it a different way than if you were just doing conventional soil mapping.